And sign up at masterclass.com/Lex to get a discount and to support this podcast. This show is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Download it at expressvpn.com/LexPod to get a discount and to support this podcast. I've been using ExpressVPN for many years. I honestly love it. It's easy to use. Press the big power on button and your privacy is protected. And if you like, you can make it look like your location is anywhere else in the world. I might be in Boston now, but I can make it look like I'm in New York, London, Paris, or anywhere else. This has a large number of obvious benefits. For example, certainly it allows you to access international versions of streaming websites like the Japanese version of Netflix or the UK version of Hulu. As you probably know, I was born in the Soviet Union, so sadly, given my roots and appreciation of Russian history and culture, my website and the website for this podcast is blocked in Russia. So this is another example of where you can use ExpressVPN to access sites like the podcast that are not accessible in your country. ExpressVPN works on any device you can imagine. I use it on Linux, shout out to Ubuntu, Windows, Android, but it's available everywhere else too. Once again, download it at expressvpn.com/LexPod to get a discount and to support this podcast. And now, here's my conversation with Vitalik Buterin. So before we talk about the fundamental ideas behind Ethereum and cryptocurrency, perhaps it'd be nice to talk about the origin story of Bitcoin and the mystery of Satoshi Nakamoto. You gave a talk that started with sort of asking the question, what did Satoshi Nakamoto actually invent? Maybe you could say, who is Satoshi Nakamoto and what did he invent?
Sure. So Satoshi Nakamoto is the name by which we know the person who originally came up with Bitcoin. So the reason why I say the name by which we know is that this is a anonymous fellow who has shown himself to us only over the internet, just by first publishing the white paper for Bitcoin, then releasing the original source code for Bitcoin, and then talking to the very early Bitcoin community on Bitcoin forums, and of interacting with them and helping the project along for a couple of years. And then at some point in late 2010 to early 2011, he disappeared. So Bitcoin is a fairly unique project in how it has this kind of mythical, kind of quasi-godlike founder who just kind of popped in, did the thing, and kind of disappeared, and we've somehow just never heard from him again.
So in 2008, the white paper was the first. Do you know if the white paper was the first time the name would actually appear, Satoshi Nakamoto?
I believe so.
So how is it possible that the creator of such a impactful project remains anonymous?
That's a tough question, and
there's no similarity to it in the history of technology as far as I'm aware.
Yeah. So one possibility is that it's Hal Finney, because Hal Finney was kind of also active in the Bitcoin community, and as Hal Finney in those two beginning years, and Hal.
Who is Hal Finney? Maybe
he's one of the people in the end of early cypherpunk community. He was
so he's a computer scientist.
Computer scientists, cryptographers, people interested in technology, internet freedom, those kinds of topics.
Was it correct that I read that he seemed to have been involved in either the earliest or the first transaction of Bitcoin?
Yes. The first transaction of Bitcoin was between Satoshi and Hal Finney.
Do you think he knew who Satoshi was?
If he wasn't Satoshi, probably no.
How is it possible to work so closely with people and nevertheless not know anything about their fundamental identity? Is this like a natural sort of characteristic of the internet? Like if we were to think about it, because you and I just met now, there's a depth of knowledge that we now have about each other that's like physical. Like my vision system is able to recognize you. I can also verify your identity of uniqueness. Like
yeah,
This
That's
like it's very hard to fake you being you. So
yes.
the internet, the internet has a fundamentally different quality to it, which is just fascinating. Can you maybe
Yeah, no, this
talk to
is
that?
definitely interesting as I definitely just know a lot of people just by their internet handles.
Yeah,
And like, to me, when I think of them, like I see their internet handles, and one of them has a kind of profile picture as this kind of face that's kind of not quite human with a bunch of kind of psychedelic colors in it. And when I visualize him, like I just visualize that.
that not an actual face.
Yeah.
You are the creator of the second, well, at least currently the second most popular cryptocurrency,
Mhm.
Ethereum. So on this topic, if we just stick on Satoshi Nakamoto for a little bit longer,
Mhm.
you may be the most qualified person to speak to the psychology of this anonymity that we're talking about.
Mhm.
Like your identity is known, like
Yes.
I've just verified it, but from your perspective, what are the benefits in creating a cryptocurrency and then remaining anonymous? Like if it can psychoanalyze
Mhm.
Satoshi Nakamoto, is there something interesting there, or is it
It
just a
def
peculiar quirk of him?
it definitely helps create this kind of image of this kind of neutral thing that doesn't belong to anyone. That you created a project, and because you're anonymous, and because you also have disappear, or as unfortunately happened to Hal Finney, if that is him, he ended up I think dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, and he's in a cryogenic freezer now. But like if you pop in and you create it, and you're gone, and all that's remaining of that whole process is the thing itself, then like no one can go and try to and if interpret any of your other behavior and try to understand like, oh, this person wrote this thing in some essay at age 16 where he expressed particular opinions about democracy, and so because of that this project is a statement that's trying to do this specific thing.
Yeah.
Like instead it creates this environment where the thing is what you make of it. And
It doesn't have the, yeah, right, the burden of your other ideas, political thought, and so on. So now that I'm sitting with you, do you feel the burden of being kind of the face of Ethereum? I mean, there's a very large community of
mhm.
developers, but nevertheless,
Yeah,
is there like a burden associated with that?
there definitely is. This is definitely a big reason why I've been trying to kind of push for the Ethereum ecosystem to become more decentralized in many ways. Just encouraging a lot of kind of core Ethereum work to happen outside of the Ethereum Foundation, and of expanding the number of people that are making different kinds of decisions, having kind of multiple software implementations instead of one, and all of these things. Like there's a lot of things that I've tried to do to and remove myself as a single point of failure, because that is something that a lot of people criticize me for.
So if you look at like the most
Uh,
fundamentally successful open source projects,
uh,
it seems that it's like
hmm,
a sad reality when I think
uh-huh,
about it. Is it seems to be that one person is a crucial contributor. Often, if you look at Linus
hmm.
for Linux for the kernel,
Yeah, that is
it's
possible, and I'm definitely not planning to disappear.
that's an interesting tension that
Mhm.
projects like this kind of desire a single entity, and yet they're fundamentally distributed.
Mhm.
I don't know if there's something interesting to say about that kind of structure and thinking about the future of cryptocurrency. Does there need to be a leader?
There's different kinds of leaders. There's dictators who control all the money. There's people who control organizations. There's kind of high priests that just have themselves and their Twitter followers.
What kind of leader are you, would you say?
Yeah, in these days, actually, a bit more in the high priest direction than before.
Yeah.
Like, I definitely actually don't do all that much of kind of going around and like ordering Ethereum Foundation people to do things because I think those things are important. If there's something that I do think is important, I do just usually kind of say it publicly or just kind of say it to people, and quite often projects just kind of start doing it.
So let's ask the high philosophical question is
Sure.
about money.
Yeah.
What at the highest level is money? What is money?
It's a kind of game, and it's a game where we have points, and if you have points, there's this one move where you can reduce your points by a number and increase someone else's points by the same number. And these,
So it's a fair game, hopefully.
well, it's one kind of fair game. Like, for example, you can have other kinds of fair games. Like, you could have a game where if I give someone a point and you give someone a point, then instead of that person getting 2 points, that person gets 4 points. And that's also fair. But money is easy to kind of set up, and it serves a lot of useful functions, and so it kind of just survives in society as a meme for thousands of years.
It's useful for the storage of wealth. It's useful for the exchange of value.
And it's also useful for denominating future payments. A unit of account.
A unit of account. So what, if you look at the history of money in human civilization, what just if you're a student of history, like how has its role or just the mechanisms of money changed over time in your view? Even if we just look at the 20th century or before, and then leading up to cryptocurrencies, that's something you think about?
Yeah, and I think like the big thing in the 20th century is kind of we saw a lot more intermediation, I guess. Like, the first part is kind of the move from adding more of different kinds of banking, and then we saw the move from kind of dollars being backed by gold to dollars being backed by gold that's only redeemable by certain people to dollars not being backed by anything, to kind of this system where you have a bunch of free floating currencies, and then people getting kind of bank accounts, and then those things becoming electronic, people getting accounts with payment processors that have bank accounts. So
what do you make of that? That's such a fascinating philosophical idea that money might not be backed by anything. What is that like fascinating to you, that money can exist without being backed by something physical?
It definitely is.
Like, what do you make of that? Like, how is that possible? Is that stable? If we look at the future of human civilization, is it possible to have money at the large scale at such a hugely productive and rich societies be able to operate successfully without money being backed by anything physical?
I feel like the interesting thing about the 21st century especially is that a lot of the important valuable things are not backed by anything. Like if you look at like tech companies, for example, like something like Twitter, right? Like you could theoretically imagine that if all of the employees wanted to, they could kind of come together, they would quit and start working on Twitter 2.0. And then the value of and just kind of build the exact same product, or possibly build a better product, and then just kind of continue on from there. And the original Twitter would kind of just not have people left anymore, right? Like there is theoretically kind of code and like IP that's owned by the company, but in reality, like good programmers could probably rewrite all that stuff in 3 months. So the reason why the thing has value is just kind of network effects and coordination problems, right? Like these employees in reality aren't going to switch all at once, and also the users aren't all going to switch at once because it's just difficult for them to switch at once. And so there's these kind of metastable kind of equilibria in interactions between thousands and millions of people that are just actually quite sticky, even though if you try to kind of assume that everyone's a perfectly rational and kind of perfectly slippery spherical cow, they don't seem to exist at all.
That stickiness, do you have a sense, a grasp of the sort of the fundamental dynamic, like the physics of that stickiness? It seems to work, but and I think some of the cryptocurrency ideas kind of rely on it working.
Yeah, it's it's the sort of thing that's definitely been economically modeled a lot. Like one the kind of analogy of something similar that you often see in textbooks as like, what is a government? Like if, for example, like 80% of people in a country just like tomorrow suddenly had the idea that like the laws that are currently the laws in the government that currently is the government are just people, and some other thing is the government, and they just kind of start acting like it, then that would kind of become the new reality. And then the question is, well, what happens if kind of between 0 and 80 people or and 80% of people start believing that? And like, what is the thing you see is that if there is one of these kind of switches happening, this kind of revolution, then if you're the first person to join, then like you probably don't have the incentive to do that. But then if you're the 55th percentile person to join, then suddenly becomes quite safe too. And so it definitely is the sort of thing that you can kind of try to analyze and understand mathematically. But one of the kind of results is that the sort of like when the switch happens definitely can be chaotic sometimes.
Yeah, but still, like to me, the idea that the network effects, the fact that human beings at a scale of like millions, billions, can share, even the idea of currency, like all agree. That's just I know economics can model it. I'm a skeptic on economic, and it's like so my favorite sort of field, maybe recreationally, psychology, is trying to understand human behavior. And I think sometimes people just kind of pretend that they can have a grasp on human behavior, even though it's such a messy space that all the models that psychology or economics, those different perspectives on human behavior can have are difficult. It's difficult to know how much that's wishful thinking and how much it is actually getting to the core of understanding human behavior. But on that idea, what do you think is the role of money in human motivation? So do you think money, from an economics perspective, from a psychology perspective, is core to like human desires?
Money is definitely very far from the only motivator. It is a big motivator, and it's one of the closest things you have to a universal motivator. Because ultimately, in like almost any person in the world, if you ask them to do something, like they'll be more inclined to do it if you also offer offer them money, right? And that's like, there's definitely many cases where people will do things other than things that maximize how much money they have, and that happens all the time. But like, though a lot of those other things are kind of much more specific to and of who that person is and of what their situation is, the relationship between the motive and the action, and these other things.
What do you think is the interplay of the other motivator from like Nietzsche perspective is power? Do you think money equals power? Do you think those are conflicting ideas? Do you think, I mean, that's one of the ideas that decentralized currency, decentralized applications are looking at is who holds the power?
Yeah. Money is definitely a kind of power. And there's definitely people who want money because it gives them power. And then even if money doesn't seem to kind of explicitly be about money, a lot of things that people spend money on are ultimately about kind of social status of some kind. So I definitely view those two things as kind of interplaying. And then there's also money as just a way of like measuring how successful you are, like as a scoreboard, right? So this kind of gets back to the game. I mean, like if you have $4 billion, then the main benefit you get from going up, well, one of the big benefits you get from going up to $6 billion is that now instead of being below the guy who has 5, you're above the guy who has 5.
So you think money could be kind of, in the game of life, it's also a measure of self-worth. It's like how we...
It's definitely how a lot of people perceive it.
Define ourselves in the hierarchy of
and I'm
society.
not saying it's kind of a healthy thing that people define their self-worth as money, because it's definitely kind of far from a perfect indicator of like how much you value you provide to society or anything like this. But I definitely think that like, as a matter of kind of current practice, a bunch of people do feel that way.
So what does utopia from an economic perspective look like to you? What does a perfect world look like?
I guess the economist's utopia would be one where kind of everything is kind of incentive aligned in the sense that there aren't kind of conflicts between what satisfies your goals and kind of what is